So next up, Gregory Melitonov is a founding partner at Taller Ken, based in New York City and Guatemala City. He earned his Master's of Architecture at the Yale School of Architecture and worked for Toshiko Mori Architect and Renzo Piano Workshop before starting his own office. Taller Ken is a very active building practice, having realized dozens of projects in Latin America and has been awarded the New York New Practices Award from the AIA. The work of Taller Ken is exuberantly colorful, rich with playful material choices, and carefully calibrated to its locales. The practice cultivates resourcefulness, finding ways of creating beauty and surprise, sometimes with very limited budgets. Public space projects such as Playa Chomo and Barrio Zona speak to this determination and ability to create moments of wonder even in neglected spaces. So I bring you Greg.
So thank you to the Architecture League, and thank you to the various friends and family and supporters that are here. I'm Gregory Melitonov, and I am one half of Taller Ken, or Taller Ken. And the firm is a Spanglish mashup of the word taller, Spanish for workshop, and the English word ken, meaning knowledge or understanding. And so baked into our practice is kind of an attention to the physical object of architecture, and also somewhat of a broader perspective of knowledge or understanding. The biggest thank you goes to my partner, Inés Guzman. We've been working together as a firm for 6 years now and have known each other for 9 years. And so it's one of the most fruitful collaborations. Hopefully you agree. But also, also, it's a little crazy sometimes. We have a somewhat, let's say, playful dynamic that plays out in the work, but also we kind of embrace a naive approach to architecture, which allows us to be both local and outside, both foreign and native. And so we try to always see things from multiple vantage points and produce something that's hopefully unexpected and unforeseen. I'm a big believer in the narrative power of architecture, the role of the architect, and the role of architecture in the public realm. And I believe through some kind of a narrative, we can stimulate somewhat of a broader discussion. So the story of Inés and I begins in Genoa, Italy, where both of us were working for Renzo Piano. So this idea of the sort of hands-on and the personality that comes along with working for someone who's been at the top of the field for more than 40 years was an extremely unique opportunity. And I guess the biggest thank you also goes to Renzo, who was kind enough to send us a handwritten congratulations that arrived through customs from Italy. So grazie mille. So we were both in Renzo's sort of, if you are an architect, you probably know something about the mystical bungalow of Renzo Piano, an extremely cloistered environment where one is able to train in almost a medieval craftsman-like style, but also it attracts a large amount of international young talent. Renzo supports the voice of young people at a level that I haven't seen in any of the other places that I've worked or spoken with my peers. And the just the exposure to so much young talent from all over the globe was inspirational to us as we developed our practice going forward. Ines and I both were design architects for the Whitney Museum's new location in downtown New York, and we were very fortunate to be involved in the process from the initial sketches all the way to the topping off of the building when we began working for ourselves. And so just being able to see one fast track project all the way through and then 2 years later be open to the public, again, another very unique experience. So obviously, especially at the tail end of the recession, and so having such a important work of civic architecture and being able to visit it almost weekly when I'm in the city and see how this piece of work has grown into the urban fabric is very interesting, but also how something that is extremely commercial is able to take on a life and meaning beyond the physical object. On the right here, you see a limited edition handbag by Max Mara that's inspired by the ribbing of the exterior facade material. And then recently, for the biennial opening, the museum itself was occupied as a space of protest. So how the edifice ends up playing out these larger roles is interesting. And sort of in kind of a reaction to that, when Ines and I moved on to do our own thing, we kind of started from scratch working with low cost materials that had a high visual impact. It's kind of an idea that's born out of necessity, trying to do more with less. And actually, the story kind of begins working even before we left Renzo's office. The group of young people, extremely talented from all over, also share an obvious passion for architecture besides Renzo's work. And so we had to commute to this bungalow, and we're always taking this urban highway, the Sopralevada, which cuts through downtown Genoa, and just as a way to kind of keep ourselves occupied as a hobby, ended up doing a sort of side project where we came up with an idea to make T-shirts to draw attention to some of the urban issues that the highway created between migrant communities who sold their sort of bootleg purses by the harbor, and city people who kind of used the highway but didn't really appreciate the downtown. I won't get into all of it, but essentially this kind of first project was a one-day installation where we hung up some T-shirts and created a space to talk about the city. And again, you see kind of young people pitching together, do it yourself, and ended up just generating conversation. Italy comes across as a very homogenous place. Genoa as a port city is actually very diverse, especially at the waterfront. And so different communities kind of came together to talk about the city and to wear some T-shirts, and it was all a hoot. Anyway, so we started our practice really in Guatemala City. This is not a place that I was familiar with before my first project was already in construction. But as a result, we've been able to grow up a fairly robust portfolio, and generally speaking, have kind of developed over time an idea about working locally, which is reflected in the show of the gallery and also in the projects of ours that I want to talk about now. So sort of the first idea of working locally, or what one's knee-jerk reaction is when you're a foreigner in a new place, is to kind of notice a characteristic that's very out of context and play it up. And I would say that so the first kind of stage for us was when given the project to do an outdoor cafe. We were very attracted to the Guatemalan textile tradition. Guatemala is one of the largest concentrations of the living Mayan heritage. And so one cannot help but notice the indigenous population and the amount of woven textiles. So we picked up on this based on trips to the interior of the country, a town specifically, San Andres Xul, is a town where they locally dye natural fiber for the production of these textiles. So the roofs of these cinder block buildings are terraced with drying skeins of thread. So for let's see, where does this go? Yeah. So this was essentially our inspiration for designing an outdoor commercial space, and using this idea of the pergola, the outdoor restaurant, which is very common in a kind of temperate climate, and being inspired by the weaving and the different curation of an existing local technique. So again, being an outsider, we simply applied a little design intelligence and kind of isolated and elevated an aspect of the design, which is fairly straightforward. A steel structure, open steel structure. The cafe is open air again. Braziers keep it warm, and it is fronting bamboo gardens and some water features. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that this idea of pattern and nature, bringing the outside in, is something that architects talk about a lot. It's something that you hear a lot in modern architecture. But when really, for us, nature or natural feeling is about a layering of color and texture. And in this image, going one step farther, where there's actually phases of natural materials that are rustic in that they are prepared to be used. So the cut logs are different than the live trees, but there's a sort of latent potential built into the aesthetic of material that's ready to be used. It's kind of stacked and ready to be deployed in some form. And so that was, let me see if I can show you you get it. That's kind of the idea with the thread skeins. They are ordered and ready to be used as part of the tectonic process of the dyeing, the spooling, the dyeing, the weaving of textile tradition. So this is kind of how all these things come together. The thread skeins act as a light baffle and an acoustic baffle for the outdoor space. So again, there's a very kind of prosaic and pragmatic aspect to the work, but also a little bit of an attempt to highlight a local element and give it kind of an unexpected treatment, which ends up being the showpiece of the project and what distinguishes it, but also, again, the layering of colors, textures that help to create this palpable feeling of being outdoors. And also you have to also imagine the sound of water, the rustling of the bamboos, etc. So the other side to this appropriation of culture is that by isolating and elevating, you can also fall too much into a kind of kitsch aspect. And so the sort of second phase as our studio progressed is to reflect culture, to really try to understand not just the ideal of the let's say the quaint local tradition that you see through your blinders as maybe a tourist, but what is the reality on the ground? And so for this next project, a kind of another interest in our studio is the reimagining of systems. Obviously, we work in a developing country where certain standards around urban growth, sustainability are not on the table, despite these countries developing at a far rapid pace without the regulation. And so when we were given the commission along the main highway that leads outside of Guatemala City and Mixco, we were confronted with sort of the realities of urban sprawl and the commercial advertising and all of the above. So to kind of highlight the issues around urban sprawl and also to address some of these issues around address some of these issues around sustainability, we created kind of a giant cube, a four-sided billboard, and welded car chassis of kind of a local I want to say shitbox, but it's a Datsun. It's kind of like the kind of average. It's called a choque is when you crash cars. So this is like the choque car, right? It's always going to be like the worst car on the road. So so on the exteriors of this kind of four-sided billboard, the idea is to catch passersby at the various speeds that the highway features, which is either zooming out of the city or stuck in traffic when you're returning. So again, another commercial project which we really look to as a project of public art. James Wines and his work with the best stores is a big influence. We had the pleasure of lecturing with him a few months ago, and he took us out to Chinese food. So that was pretty fun too. But anyway, the project from the exterior is very separate from the interior. Again, a four-sided billboard with that kind of blocks out the context, and inside is a kind of urban oasis meant to, let's see, yeah. So a bit of an urban oasis that highlights all of the natural systems. So it's sawtooth skylight daylighting. The rainwater is collected in the bright blue tanks, which makes one of the elevations. That rainwater is used to feed the fountains and the 15-foot palm trees that compartmentalize the interior, and the whole space is naturally ventilated. So, and then again, a kind of layering of local materials, patterns, and textures to convey, in this case, the sensation of being outside, being indoors. So local patio tiles are combined with a custom-made tile to create these this kind of carpets of tiled area, but reclaiming some material and mixing it with some new, and layering up all of these flavors and colors to really create the feeling of being in a tropical space, in a tropical climate, next to a very smoggy highway. And this is how all of those things kind of come together. So you can see the the reclaimed water tanks really coming to the forefront, but they actually, to me, look more like this sort of service box that's to the side that houses the kitchen, bathrooms, and employees area. Feels more like a kind of gas station, repair station, and the exposed scaffolding kind of has this. As if like the decorated shed had kind of been pulled out and created a room inside it. So this ties in. The upholstery has local textiles used, local floor tiles mixed with kind of the language of big box retail that's all imported from different countries to spur the sprawl. The sort of the third phase that evolved of working locally after sort of mining the culture for things that were different, reflecting the culture for things that are maybe both local and global issues at the same time, was to see how we could actually start shaping culture beyond making a visual impact which would generate discussion. It's great, but also how could we begin to educate people from the youngest possible age? So similar to Renzo's office, which has a kind of in-house internship residency program, we decided to start our own, which was a bad idea. This slide talks about something, a term which I learned from a graphic designer who did our branding, Benjamin Cridden. And he talked about the difference between fine art and applied art. And I don't know which one architecture is, but I think it has to be both. And there isn't, I think the need to teach basic tool literacy, basic construction, etc., is paramount, and it's something that we have had to reteach ourselves. Part of taking the plunge as young architects is having to cut your learning by doing, from everything from how buildings get put together on site to how do you interact with clients and promote yourself to the world at large. So in addition to Taller Ken, we also started the Fundamental Design Build Initiative. This came about when we were awarded the AIA New Practices Award. We were operating in the very small corner of the world, and suddenly we were receiving 10 resumes, 30 resumes a day. And this kind of created probably a typical problem that most architecture offices face, where there's a huge amount of talent and not a lot of work. So not only did we find that these young people had an incredible amount of enthusiasm and energy just to come and work for us, but also were very sympathetic to the fact that they didn't seem to be finding any other opportunities besides applying to our studio, or at least having a poor time of it. And so faced with this problem, also how to compare, let's say, a student from a school on one side of the world from a very meaningful student from another side of the world. So how do you kind of compare apples and oranges? And so our approach was to just hire everyone who applied to our office. Now that was resulted in these students. So we made kind of a proposal to the people who applied basically was that if you come down to Guatemala, we will do something. And and it worked. So I think maybe one of these wonderful young people is here. So these, yes, 5 minutes. Oh crap! Goodness, excuse my language. I will go through this very quickly. All right. So in the end, these great young people ended up designing and building something. It's a temporary installation in the parking lot of a disused parking lot of the Civic Theater. Basically, the program takes you through construction, design conception, construction, development, building it yourself, and promoting it, and seeking sponsor companies. All of this in 3 months. The project ended up being a big success, using recycled materials and donated materials, and connecting with the local community that it serves. It also influenced very much the students, I think, who Guatemala wasn't necessarily a place where they would have considered coming before, but ended up the country ended up leaving an impact on them, and they ended up leaving an impact on the city as well, making something of quite an impressive scale, I think. We ran this project again the following year, and because of the nature of the first project was temporary and sort of tied with a civic institution, we decided to do something that was a little more working in a community, so working in Barrio Girona, which is one of the most troubled areas in Guatemala City. It's a red light area and has a lot of problems. We ended up doing something that was a little more engaged in terms of working with the community to do lasting improvements, which mostly included a lot of concrete and planting. So sort of, again, the kind of way that the program works is that our company provides the seed, the core is these international students, and then the next ring out is local students and experts that contribute their skill set as well, and then finally cultural sponsor institutions and donor companies. So what's been interesting about both projects is in both projects there's been a kind of a subsequent someone has inherited the project each time. So for the first project, and Saturday Orphans program ended up taking over the space, which originally didn't have any program intent. It was just kind of a pavilion, but it ended up being a backdrop for this youth program, and then for this second iteration in a group called Happy People, a kind of youth organization, ended up coming back to that site and doing more initiatives with the community. So the program has really served to kind of plant that seed to allow relationships to grow. And then, the third iteration of this is taking place right now in Costa Rica, where we have another amazing group of 10 architects from 7 countries, and they've identified a site that has a sustainability component and an ecology component as well, mixing together urban infrastructure with natural systems, including the urban river, the Rio Torres, as well as air and water. So contaminated river, Rio Torres, and the air pollution, as well as favela structures that are on the riverbank, and kind of more affluent communities that use the park for recreational purposes. So for the past 2 weeks, they've been in San Jose, meeting all the right people and also having a good time. So we'll see what they come up with. Thank you so much.